July 26, 1945. Tinian Island, the Marianas. The heat on the tarmac was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the few men authorized to be there. The USS Indianapolis, CA-35, a Portland-class heavy cruiser and the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, sat anchored in the harbor, her hull vibrating slightly with the idle of her engines. She had just completed a speed run from San Francisco that had shattered records, covering 5,000 miles in only 10 days. But this speed was not for glory. It was born of a necessity so secret that not even the Captain, Charles McVay III, knew the precise nature of his cargo. A massive wooden crate had been lashed to the hangar deck, surrounded by an armed Marine Guard detachment, with orders to shoot to kill any unauthorized personnel who approached. Inside the ship, welded to the deck of the Admiral's cabin, was a heavy metal canister. The contents of these two packages, the crate and the canister, were the components of Little Boy, or the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima 11 days later, specifically the uranium-235 projectile and the gun assembly mechanism. The Indianapolis had successfully delivered the means to end the war. Her mission was technically complete. As the components were offloaded onto the humid airstrip of Tinian, a sense of relief washed over the crew. They had been racing across the Pacific without an escort, relying on speed to outrun Japanese submarines, carrying a burden that could have vaporized the ship had an accident occurred. Now, they believed, the danger was behind them. The ship was ordered to proceed to Guam, then to Leyte in the Philippines to join the staging for the invasion of Japan. The mood aboard was light. The crew of 1,196 men, ranging from seasoned veterans of the Aleutian campaign to fresh recruits who had never seen combat, anticipated a brief period of training before the final push toward Tokyo. They did not know that they were about to sail into a perfect convergence of bureaucratic negligence and predatory nature. On July 28th, the Indianapolis departed Guam for Leyte. The route was a straight line across the Philippine Sea, a stretch of open ocean known as the Peddy Route. Before departure, Captain McVay requested an escort. The Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser, armed with 8-inch guns and capable of 32 knots, but she lacked the sonar equipment and depth charges necessary to hunt submarines effectively. Her defense was her speed. However, the request for a destroyer escort was denied. The Naval Command in Guam assessed the threat level along the route as negligible. Intelligence reports suggested that the Imperial Japanese Navy was effectively neutralized. Its surface fleet sunk, and its submarines blockaded in their home ports. This assessment was tragically incorrect. The intelligence officers had failed to account for the desperate, final offensive of the Japanese submarine force, the chitin-equipped boats that were prowling the shipping lanes. Furthermore, McVay was given an ambiguous directive regarding zigzagging, the practice of steering a zigzag course to make a ship a difficult target for torpedoes. The orders stated that zigzagging was at the discretion of the commanding officer, typically to be employed during daylight or in poor visibility. As the Indianapolis steamed west, the weather was moderate, the seas choppy, and the visibility intermittent. Beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, commanding the Japanese submarine I-58, was searching for a target. Hashimoto was a pragmatic and skilled officer, operating one of the few remaining capable warships of the Empire. His submarine was carrying a terrifying new weapon, the chitin. These were manned suicide torpedoes, piloted by young men locked inside a steel tube packed with explosives, designed to be guided manually into the hull of an enemy ship. Hashimoto had already lost several chitin pilots in failed attacks, and the moral burden of sending men to certain death weighed on him. He preferred to use his conventional torpedoes, the Type 95s, which were among the most advanced in the world, fast, long-range, and equipped with massive warheads. On the night of July 29th, shortly after 11 p.m., the Indianapolis was steaming at 17 knots. The night was dark, with heavy cloud cover obscuring the moon. Captain McVay, judging the visibility to be poor enough to conceal the ship, ordered the cessation of zigzagging to save time and fuel. He retired to his emergency cabin near the bridge. The ship was running quiet, her crew sleeping on the decks to escape the stifling heat of the unventilated compartments below. At 23:30, the I-58 surfaced to recharge her batteries and ventilate the boat. Hashimoto climbed to the bridge with his binoculars. Against the black horizon, he spotted a silhouette. It was a large ship moving straight and steady. He initially identified it as an Idaho-class battleship due to its size. He ordered the submarine to dive and maneuver for an attack. The Titan pilots clamored for the opportunity to launch, begging to be allowed to die for the Emperor. Hashimoto denied them. The target was broadside, presenting a perfect firing solution for conventional torpedoes. He did not need to sacrifice men. He simply needed to do the math. At 0:04 on July 30th, Hashimoto ordered a spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes fired at 2-second intervals. The torpedoes left the tubes, their oxygen fuel engines propelling them at 48 knots toward the unsuspecting cruiser. The travel time was less than a minute. The first torpedo struck the Indianapolis in the starboard bow. The explosion was catastrophic. It obliterated the forward 40 feet of the ship, instantly killing the men in the berthing compartments and severing the bow almost completely. The massive weight of the detached steel hung from the hull for a moment before tearing free, dragging the ship down by the head. The Indianapolis was still moving forward at 17 knots, effectively driving herself underwater. Seconds later, the second torpedo slammed into the midships, directly beneath the bridge, near the powder magazines and fuel tanks. This second explosion was the death blow. It ripped the ship open, venting high-pressure steam and igniting the aviation fuel stored for the reconnaissance planes. The ship's electrical system was severed instantly. The lights went out. The radio room, located near the impact zone, was thrown into darkness. The equipment was tossed from the bulkheads, and the operators were thrown to the deck. The chaos that followed was absolute. The Indianapolis immediately took on a severe list to starboard. Fire raged through the superstructure, cooking off ammunition and illuminating the night with a hellish glow. Below decks, the situation was gruesome. The men in the forward compartments were incinerated or crushed instantly. Those further aft woke to a world tilted at a crazy angle, filled with smoke and the screams of the dying. The ladder wells, the only escape routes, became vertical traps. Men formed human chains, pulling each other up through hatches as the water rose beneath them. Captain McVay, thrown from his bunk, scrambled to the bridge. He found a scene of total devastation. The communication systems were dead. He could not issue orders to the engine room to stop the ship. The Indianapolis was plowing under, scooping up the ocean. Within minutes, the list reached 45 degrees. McVay realized the ship was doomed. He gave the order to abandon ship, though the word had to be passed by mouth, shouting over the roar of escaping steam and fire. The abandonment was not an organized evacuation. It was a desperate leap into the dark. There was no time to launch the lifeboats. The ship was rolling over too fast. Men simply jumped from the railings, sliding down the barnacle-encrusted hull, dropping into the oil-slicked water. Many were sucked into the spinning propellers, which were still turning as the stern rose into the air. Others were struck by falling debris. At 16, just 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the USS Indianapolis rolled completely onto her side and slipped beneath the surface. She went down vertically, her stern pointing at the sky, taking nearly 300 men with her to the bottom. Approximately 900 men were left floating in the Philippine Sea. The immediate aftermath was a period of shock and adrenaline. The water was covered in a thick layer of heavy fuel oil, a viscous, toxic substance that coated the men's eyes, filled their noses, and induced vomiting when swallowed. The survivors formed loose groups, clinging to debris, crates, and the few floater nets that had drifted free. Many were wounded, suffering from severe burns, broken bones, and lacerations. They were scattered over a mile of ocean, bobbing in the black swell, listening to the cries of their shipmates in the dark. Despite the horror of the sinking, there was a prevailing sense of optimism among the survivors during those first few hours. They were the flagship of the Fifth Fleet. They were overdue in Leyte. Surely, the Navy knew. Surely, the SOS signals had been heard. They believed that by dawn, the seaplanes would appear, dipping their wings, and the destroyers would come steaming over the horizon. The men checked their life jackets, standard-issue kapok jackets for some, inadequate pneumatic belts for others, and settled in to wait. But the SOS had not been heard. Or rather, it had been heard and ignored. In the frantic minutes before the ship sank, the radio operators had managed to key out a distress signal on the emergency transmitter. SOS, 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 Lat 12, N long 135E, torpedoed. Sinking fast. The signal was received by 3 separate stations. At a station in the Philippines, the commanding officer was drunk and told his subordinate not to disturb him. At a station in Okinawa, the operator received the message but dismissed it as a Japanese deception, a ruse to lure rescue ships into an ambush. And on a tugboat nearby, the radio operator heard the faint signal, but because he was not authorized to respond to fleet messages, he simply logged it and did nothing. The bureaucratic failure extended far beyond the radio rooms. The naval tracking system of 1945 was dangerously flawed. The movement of combatant ships like the Indianapolis was tracked on a plotting board. When a ship arrived at a destination, it was marked as arrived. However, there was no protocol for reporting the non-arrival of a combat ship. The directive, known as Movement Report 5-45, explicitly stated, "Arrivals of combatants shall not be reported." This meant that when the Indianapolis failed to appear in Leyte on July 31st, the port director simply assumed she had been diverted or delayed. No one picked up a phone. No one sent a query. The ship was simply erased from the board. As far as the U.S. Navy was concerned, the Indianapolis existed in a state of quantum superposition, both safe and missing, until proven otherwise. Back in the water, the sun rose on July 30th. The heat returned, instantly brutal. The fuel oil on the surface of the water absorbed the solar radiation, cooking the men who were coated in it. Thirst began to set in, but the most terrifying development came from below. The explosion and the sinking had sent a massive acoustic shockwave through the ocean. It was a dinner bell. The vibration and the scent of blood drew predators from miles away. The first sharks to arrive were likely oceanic whitetips, Carchahinus longimanus. Unlike the great white or the tiger shark, which are coastal hunters, the oceanic whitetip is a pelagic scavenger. It lives in the deep, open ocean, a nutrient-poor desert where food is scarce. Consequently, it is aggressively opportunistic. It does not fear humans. It views any disturbance on the surface as a potential meal. They are recognizable by their massive, rounded pectoral fins tipped with white. At first, the sharks were cautious. They circled the perimeter of the survivor groups, their dorsal fins cutting the water. They bumped against the men, testing them, rubbing their sandpaper-like skin against the sailors' legs to see if the prey would fight back. This behavior, known as bumping, is a prelude to an attack. It terrified the men. They huddled closer together, creating shark watches, kicking and splashing to drive the animals away. By the afternoon of the first day, the testing ended and the feeding began. The sharks initially targeted the dead. Bodies that were floating in their life jackets were dragged under, thrashing violently before disappearing. The water turned pink around the attacks. Then they turned to the wounded. The scent of blood was irresistible. Men who were bleeding from torpedo injuries were pulled from the edges of the groups. Their screams were short, cut off as they were dragged into the depths. The survivors quickly learned a grim hierarchy. To be alone was to die. To be bleeding was to die. The center of the group was the safest place, but everyone fought to be in the center, pushing the weaker men to the perimeter. The large group of survivors, nearly 300 men led by Captain McVay, had lashed their rafts together, creating a small island of safety. But the hundreds of others, drifting in smaller clusters or alone in their lifebelts, had no such protection. As night fell on the first day, the temperature dropped. The men, burned by the sun during the day, now froze. They were suspended in saltwater, which sucked the moisture from their bodies through osmosis. Dehydration began to affect their cognitive functions, but the terror of the dark was worse than the cold. In the pitch blackness, they could not see the fins. They could only feel the water moving, the brush of a rough flank against a leg, followed by the scream of a shipmate being taken. The sounds of crunching bone and tearing flesh carried clearly over the water. The sharks were feeding in a frenzy, emboldened by the lack of resistance. By the morning of day 2, Tuesday, July 31st, the condition of the survivors had deteriorated markedly. The Kapok life jackets, designed to remain buoyant for 48 hours, were becoming waterlogged. The men had to work harder to keep their heads above the surface, exhausting their limited energy reserves. The dehydration was becoming critical. The human body requires fresh water to process the salt it absorbs through the skin and inevitable ingestion. Without it, the sodium levels in the blood spike, a condition called hypernatremia. Hypernatremia affects the brain first. It causes confusion, then delirium, then violent hallucinations. Men began to crack. Some believed they were back on the ship. They had lucid conversations with wives and mothers who weren't there. Others became paranoid. In the vast, featureless ocean, the mind imposes patterns. Men started to see islands just below the surface. "The ship is just down there," one would shout. "I can see the commissary. They have cold water." He would unclip his life vest and dive down to get a drink, drowning in a delusional pursuit of relief. Even worse were the men who drank the seawater. Driven mad by thirst, they ignored the warnings of the older sailors. "Don't drink the water," the officers yelled. "It will kill you." But as the sun beat down and their tongues swelled in their mouths, the temptation became overwhelming. Those who drank experienced a brief moment of relief, followed by agonizing cramps, vomiting, and a rapid acceleration of madness. They became violent, thrashing in the water, attacking their shipmates. This thrashing attracted the sharks. The feeding frenzy intensified. The social order in the water began to collapse. Officers removed their insignia to avoid being targeted by delirious enlisted men who blamed them for the disaster. Fights broke out over life jackets. Men suffering from photophobia, extreme sensitivity to light caused by the glare, pressed their faces into the oily water to escape the sun, inhaling the toxic sludge. Meanwhile, at the naval base in Leyte, the Indianapolis was now overdue, but the Combat Reporting Board remained static. The port operations officer noted the ship hadn't arrived, but assuming it was a routine delay or a change in orders he wasn't privy to, he did nothing. No inquiry was sent to Guam, no alert was raised. The 900 men were dying, and the Navy did not even know they were missing. By the third day, Wednesday, August 4, the survivors were entering a state of living death. Their skin was sloughing off in sheets due to the exposure to salt water and fuel oil, a condition known as immersion maceration. Their eyes were swollen shut. The shark attacks had become constant, almost rhythmic. The sharks would circle, select a victim, and strike. The survivors were too weak to fight back. They simply watched as their friends were eaten. The hallucinations became collective. A mass hysteria swept through one group. Someone shouted that there was a Japanese submarine nearby, and that the men in the water were actually Japanese spies trying to kill them. In the ensuing panic, Americans began killing Americans. They held each other underwater, stabbed each other with knives, fighting a phantom enemy while the real enemy, the sharks, circled and waited for the bodies to go limp. Another group believed the Indianapolis had not sunk, but was floating just below the surface, and that the mess hall was open. A line formed, a queue of dying men treading water, waiting to descend into the dining hall. One by one, they would unclip their vestiges and swim down into the abyss, drowning with a smile on their faces. Captain McVay, drifting with his group on a raft, watched the disintegration of his crew. He was physically intact, but psychologically tormented. He checked his watch constantly, calculating the time. 72 hours. Why hadn't they come? The realization was slowly dawning on him. No one is coming. We have been forgotten. The sharks were now emboldened to the point of fearlessness. They were no longer picking off the stragglers. They were swimming into the center of the groups. Men would feel the pressure wave of the shark passing, then the teeth. There was no defense. The pneumatic life belts worn by many were leaking. As the air escaped, men sank lower in the water. To stay afloat, they had to cling to the dead. The dead became rafts for the living, until the bodies decomposed or were eaten, forcing the living to find new support. The sun set on the third day. The ocean was calm, a mirror reflecting the stars. The silence was broken only by the prayers of the dying and the splash of the predators. Of the 900 men who went into the water, more than 500 were already dead. The survivors were now numbering fewer than 400. They were drifting apart, the current scattering them over 20 miles of ocean. They were alone in the geographical center of the Pacific War, invisible to the world, slowly being digested by the sea. Thursday, that was August 2nd, 1945. The fourth day broke over the Philippine Sea with a cruel, cloudless clarity. For the men drifting in the oil-slicked swells, the rising sun was no longer a sign of hope, but a torture device. The physiological limit of the human body had been reached, and, for many, exceeded. Of the nearly 900 men who had gone into the water on Sunday night, fewer than 400 remained alive. The cohesion of the group had dissolved. The large rafts that had provided a semblance of community in the early hours were now drifting apart, carrying cargoes of the dead and the comatose. The sharks, gorged after 72 hours of continuous feeding, had become less frenzied but more persistent, circling the perimeter of the survivor clusters like wolves waiting for a straggler to drop behind. The men were no longer fighting the ocean. They were merging with it. Their skin, macerated by salt water and fuel oil, was sloughing off in sheets. Their tongues were swollen to twice their normal size, cracking and bleeding, blocking their airways. Hallucinations were no longer intermittent flashes of delirium, but a shared, permanent reality. Men held conversations with invisible family members, saw islands with fresh water fountains just below the surface, or believed the Japanese were climbing up from the depths to strangle them. The discovery of the survivors, when it finally occurred, was not the result of the Navy's tracking system, which still listed the Indianapolis as assumed arrived in Leyte. It was a statistical miracle born of a mechanical failure. Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn was piloting a PV-1 Ventura bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol from the island of Peleliu. He was flying at 3,000 feet, his mind on the monotony of the patrol, when a trailing antenna weight on his aircraft snapped. The loose cable began to whip violently against the fuselage, threatening to damage the tail control surfaces. Gwynn handed the controls to his co-pilot and went aft to manually winch in the cable. It was a task that required him to look down through the blister window in the floor of the fuselage. As he wrestled with the winch, his eyes focused on the ocean below. He saw a massive oil slick stretching for miles across the blue water. In 1945, an oil slick was a tactical signature. It usually meant a Japanese submarine had been damaged and was venting fuel, or was surfacing to recharge batteries. Gwynn's instinct was to attack. He scrambled back to the cockpit, ordered a steep combat dive and opened the bomb bay doors. The Ventura screamed down toward the water, preparing to drop depth charges on the suspected enemy sub. It was only as the altimeter dropped below 1,000 feet that the visual picture resolved itself. The black dots in the oil were not debris. They were not mechanical parts. They were heads, hundreds of them, and they were splashing. Gwynn pulled out of the dive at the last second, his heart pounding. He radioed his base at Peleliu with a message that confused the operators. Sighted many men in water. Lat 11 to 30 north, long 133-30 east. The base, unaware of any missing ships, asked for clarification. Was it a troop transport? A landing craft? Gwynn replied that he didn't know, but the scale was massive. He dropped life rafts and emergency transmitters, but as he circled low, he saw the sharks attacking the empty rafts before the men could even reach them. The first vessel to respond to Gwynn's frantic calls was a PBY Catalina, a lumbering amphibious flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks. Codenamed Playmate 2, the aircraft was loaded with survival gear. Marks arrived on the scene hours later, in the late afternoon. What he saw from the cockpit changed the parameters of his mission instantly. He saw the sharks. He saw men being dragged under in real time. He saw sailors too weak to grab the lines he dropped. Marks realized that dropping supplies was useless. The men were too incapacitated to save themselves. He made a decision that violated every standing order in the manual. The PBY was designed to land in calm harbors, not in the open ocean with 12-foot swells. A landing attempt risked shearing the hull, flipping the aircraft yours and killing his entire crew. Marks looked at his flight engineer and announced he was going in. He executed a power stall landing, dropping the heavy aircraft into a trough between the waves. The impact was violent. Rivets popped along the fuselage, and the hull groaned under the stress, but the plane remained watertight. Marks began to taxi the aircraft through the debris field, turning the flying boat into a floating ambulance. The rescue was brutal. The survivors were slippery with oil. When the crew of the PBY grabbed the men by their arms to haul them aboard, the skin often peeled away in their hands, exposing the raw flesh beneath. The men were skeletal, blinded by the sun and raving mad. Marks prioritized the singles, the men drifting alone who were most vulnerable to the sharks. As the cabin filled up, Marks ordered his crew to use parachute cord to tie survivors to the wings. They stacked men on top of the fuselage like cordwood. By nightfall, the PBY was so overloaded it would never fly again. It was a bobbing cork, carrying 56 survivors, with Marks and his crew standing on the wings, using their service pistols to shoot sharks that tried to attack the legs of the men dangling in the water. While Marks fought to keep his overloaded plane afloat, the destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle, DE-368, commanded by Captain Graham Claytor, was steaming at flank speed toward the coordinates. Claytor, having intercepted Gwynn's initial report, had decided to move without waiting for orders from high command, a decision that likely saved hundreds of lives. As the Doyle approached the area shortly after midnight, Claytor faced a tactical dilemma. He was in submarine-infested waters. The Indianapolis had just been sunk by a sub. Standard procedure dictated running dark and silent, but Claytor knew that finding heads in the water at night was impossible. He ordered the ship's massive 24-inch searchlights turned on. He pointed the beams straight up into the clouds, creating a pillar of light visible for miles. To the men in the water, hallucinating and near death, the light appeared as a divine intervention. Some thought it was angels. Others thought the sun had risen early. It was the beacon that guided the scattered groups toward salvation. The extraction process took days. Other ships, including the USS Bassett and the USS Register, arrived to assist. The scenes on the decks of the rescue ships were horrific. The survivors were vomiting oil and blood. Medical corpsmen ran out of plasma and morphine. The bodies of the dead were retrieved for identification, their dog tags checked against the manifest before being buried at sea. When the final count was tallied, the magnitude of the disaster was numbing. Of the 1,196 men who had departed Guam, only 316 were pulled from the water alive. 880 men were dead. It was the greatest single loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy. But as the survivors were being treated in hospitals on Guam, the machinery of the Navy Department in Washington was already turning, not to investigate the tracking failure, but to find a scapegoat. The timing of the disaster was politically sensitive. The atomic bomb delivered by the Indianapolis was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, just 4 days after the rescue began. The war was ending. The Navy prepared to release the news of the Indianapolis on August 15th, the same day President Truman announced the surrender of Japan. It was a calculated move to bury the tragedy under the headlines of VJ Day. The public celebrated the end of the war, largely overlooking the announcement that a heavy cruiser had been lost. But the families of the 880 dead men noticed, and they demanded answers. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, a man known for his icy temperament, ordered a court of inquiry. The Navy needed to explain how a flagship could vanish for 4 days without anyone noticing. The investigation quickly revealed the systemic failures. The Movement Report 5-45, directive that prevented reporting non-arrivals, the ignored SOS signals, the lack of an escort. These were failures of the system, failures of the high command. But the Navy could not indict itself. Instead, they focused their crosshairs on Captain Charles McVay III. In December 1945, at the Washington Navy Yard, the United States Navy convened a general court-martial against Captain McVay. He was charged with 2 offenses: failure to issue a timely order to abandon ship, and hazarding the ship by failing to zigzag. It was a show trial from the start. McVay was the only captain in World War II to be court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action. The abandoned ship charge collapsed quickly when survivors testified that the torpedoes had destroyed the communication system, making a formal order impossible. The prosecution then pivoted to the zigzag charge. They argued that if McVay had been steering a zigzag course, the torpedoes would have missed. To prove this point, the prosecution took a step that was unprecedented in military law and shocked the American public. They subpoenaed Mochitsura Hashimoto, the commander of the Japanese submarine I-58, the man who had sunk the Indianapolis. Hashimoto, technically still an enemy combatant as the peace treaty had not yet been signed, was flown from Tokyo to Washington, D.C. He walked into the courtroom wearing a borrowed American suit, facing the man whose ship he had destroyed. The prosecution asked him a simple question. If the Indianapolis had been zigzagging, Would you have been able to hit her? Hashimoto's answer was not what the Navy expected. Speaking through a translator, the Japanese commander was pragmatic and professional. He explained that his chitin-equipped torpedoes, the Type 95 SOS, were faster and had a longer range than American intelligence realized. He described the visibility that night as sufficient for a periscope attack. He stated clearly, "I would have hit the ship whether it was zigzagging or not." He explained that at that short range, maneuvering would have been irrelevant. Despite this exonerating testimony from the expert witness, the enemy himself, the court was determined to convict. The admirals on the bench, protecting the reputation of the service, found McVay guilty of hazarding his ship. The sentence was lenient. McVay lost numbers in his seniority but was not imprisoned, but the verdict was a life sentence of a different kind. It officially branded him as the man responsible for the deaths of 880 sailors. The Navy had its scapegoat. The tracking failure was glossed over. The denial of the escort was forgotten. McVay was left to carry the weight alone. He retired from the Navy in 1949, receiving a tombstone promotion to Rear Admiral, and retreated to a quiet life in Litchfield, Connecticut. But the mail followed him. For 20 years, on Christmas and the anniversary of the sinking, he received hateful letters from the grieving parents of the lost crew. "You killed my son," they wrote. "I hope you cannot sleep. Why are you alive when my boy is dead?" McVay bore this abuse with stoic silence. He never publicly criticized the Navy. He attended the survivor reunions, where the men who had been in the water with him stood at attention and saluted him, knowing the truth that the public did not. But the burden was cumulative. On the morning of November 6, 1968, Charles McVay dressed in his uniform. He walked out to the front porch of his home. In one hand, he held a toy sailor that he had kept as a talisman. In the other, he held his service revolver. He placed the barrel against his temple and pulled the trigger. The Indianapolis had claimed its final victim, 23 years after it sank. The story seemed destined to end there, a dark chapter of injustice buried in the archives. But in 1996, history took a strange turn. A 12-year-old boy named Hunter Scott, living in Pensacola, Florida, watched the movie Jaws. He was captivated by the monologue delivered by the character Quinty, who describes the shark attacks of the Indianapolis. Scott decided to make the sinking the subject of his middle school history fair project. He was naive, unburdened by the politics of 1945, and simply started asking questions. He placed ads in naval magazines looking for survivors. To his surprise, they answered. Scott began to accumulate hundreds of letters and interviews. The survivors told him a consistent story. McVay was innocent. The Navy had failed them. Emboldened, the boy began to dig into the declassified records that had been released in the 1990s. He found what the defense attorneys in 1945 had missed. He found the ultra-intelligence intercepts, which proved that the Navy knew Japanese submarines were operating in the Indianapolis's path, but had failed to warn McVay. He found the logs from the listening stations that had ignored the SOS calls. He realized that the trial had been rigged to hide the incompetence of the High Command. Hunter Scott's project went from a cardboard display in a school gymnasium to the halls of the United States Congress. The media fell in love with the story. The boy and the old sailors fighting the Pentagon. Scott testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. He brought the survivors with him. Frail men in their 80s who wept as they told the senators about the captain who had saved them. The Navy resisted, arguing that reopening the case would set a dangerous precedent. But the moral weight of the evidence was undeniable. In October 2000, President Bill Clinton signed a resolution passed by Congress that officially exonerated Captain McVay. In July 2001, the Secretary of the Navy ordered McVay's service record corrected. It was a vindication that came 33 years too late for the captain, but just in time for the dying survivors. While the legal battle was won, the physical ship remained lost. The Indianapolis lay in one of the deepest and most inaccessible parts of the Pacific Ocean, the Mariana Basin. For 72 years, expeditions had failed to locate her. The depth was extreme, over 18,000 feet, deeper than the Titanic or the Bismarck. In 2017, a team led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, aboard the research vessel Petrel, launched a new search using advanced autonomous underwater vehicles. They analyzed the drift patterns of the survivors to backtrack the ship's likely sinking position. On August 19, 2017, the cameras of the underwater drone illuminated a ghostly shape in the eternal darkness. It was a spare parts box, then a gun turret, and then the hull itself. Preserved by the crushing pressure and the lack of oxygen at that extreme depth, the ship was in pristine condition. The grey paint was still visible. The number 35 stood out clearly on the bow. The Indianapolis was sitting upright on the seabed, her guns trained outward, surrounded by the debris of her violent end. The images were broadcast to the world, providing a final visual closure to the families who had wondered for generations where their loved ones lay. The discovery of the wreck revealed something else, a detail that spoke to the suddenness of the catastrophe. The hangar doors were open, the elevators were in position. The ship looked ready to fight, frozen in the moment of 1945. It was a steel tomb for the hundreds of men who had been trapped below decks when the torpedoes hit, men whose bodies were never recovered and who remain on patrol in the deep. The legacy of the USS Indianapolis is complex. It is a story of the ultimate weapon that ended a war and the ultimate negligence that cost a crew. It changed naval procedure forever. The movement report system was overhauled to ensure that no ship could ever vanish without an alarm being raised. It changed the way the Navy viewed survival equipment, leading to the development of better life rafts and shark repellents, but mostly it stands as a monument to the resilience of the human spirit under the most horrific conditions imaginable. The survivors, the members of the USS Indianapolis Survivors Organization, continued to meet until the very end, their numbers dwindling until only a handful remained. They did not gather to talk about the sharks or the thirst. They gathered to toast Captain McVay. They gathered to remember the boys who gave up their life jackets to save others. They gathered to bear witness to the truth that the Navy tried to hide, that in the vast indifference of the ocean and the cold calculus of war, the only thing that matters is the man floating next to you. The Indianapolis delivered the bomb, but the crew paid the price. And while the ship has been found, the question of why they were left to die for 4 days remains a scar on the history of the U.S. Navy that no resolution can fully heal. Subscribe to Maritime Tales, because the sea has a memory and it keeps its dead.